Returning to Bosnia from where he reported during the war between 1991 and 1995, he discovers nationalist arguments have resurfaced, bureaucracy is stifling the country, and the cult of personality embodied in Tito continues with Bosnia's current leaders. Martin visits a country in crisis to find out if the security of the entire region is once more under threat, in The Rise and Fall of Yugoslavia.
There are some people in the West who say, if Tito had lived longer, he would have prevented the war. That is quite possible. He controlled the army and he might have prevented it, by sheer force. But it is not enough to conquer. You have to convince. You have to create institutional arrangements. You have to put the state on a firm foundation of the rule of law. From his own point of view, it might have been better if he had died earlier.
Well, this is a Croatian checkpoint on the edge of civilization as far as Croatia is concerned. We're going on.
In Zagreb itself, air raid warnings have gone off throughout the day, although there have been no actual attacks there.
In Zagreb this morning, an air raid warning sent people running for cover yet again. These warnings are a regular feature of life here, but the threat and air raids have not yet materialized.
When you consecrate your life to something, when you suffered and have so many sacrifices in your family, and suddenly everything starts to collapse, you can have imagined what was tragic for the men to face this again, and especially for somebody who was doing what I was doing in the past.
In all previous occasions in Bosnia, when I heard the word ceasefire, I would head for the nearest and deepest bunker I could find. I hope this is different, and I think Nikola Koljevic had it right when he said that this is the first time the Americans...
President Clinton could hardly contain his pleasure when he was able, at last, to announce that a ceasefire had been agreed in Bosnia and would take effect in 5 days' time. It'll last for 60 days in the first instance, but the hope is that the negotiations...
The international community invested so much here, militarily, politically and financially. The question is, why we have so modest results? I think that it was invested in an inconsistent institutional framework. And, to be honest, a lot of these funds has been eaten up by corruption octopuses. Now, I think the international community should continue its involvement here. They are obliged to do this.
I'm back outside the once notorious Holiday Inn in Sarajevo, a special place for me for all sorts of reasons. No sniping now, no mortars either. All that's changed. What hasn't is that there is still not much of a functioning government in Bosnia, but so many parliaments, politicians and presidencies imposed under the Dayton Agreement as to be a formula for drift and deadlock, a constitutional nightmare. Also an opportunity for nationalist politicians to play on the worst fears of their people. There's no going back to Tito's Yugoslavia, of course. Even the Yugo-nostalgics acknowledge this. But even Tito's critics and admirers generally agree that by edging closer to membership of the European Union, the three largest republics, Serbia, Bosnia and Croatia, while not returning to brotherhood and unity, may live more easily with each other and with their own minorities. But that's a long way in the distance. It's the near future that lies between the worrying and the deeply alarming.
The first 12 years, broadly up, I think, to 2006, Bosnia made almost incredible progress. I mean, it was the world's best example of a successful post-conflict stabilization. You remember the terror that ruled Bosnia during those 4 years of the war. You'll remember the chaos afterwards. And yet in the space of 10 years, Bosnia moved from the return of 1 million refugees, free elections held under Bosnian auspices, I think, and was frequently quoted as the best example of a successful post-conflict stabilization. And one of Europe's examples of progress is about to become one of Europe's examples of a problem again.
So what went wrong? In the second part of my series on the rise and fall of Yugoslavia, I've returned to Bosnia, a special place for me, a country that I love as much as my own. Like many love affairs, it's bittersweet. A long-standing ceasefire since Dayton in 1995 is accompanied and threatened by constitutional deadlock, also by courtesy of the Dayton Agreement. Paddy Ashdown, who we just heard from, was the EU's High Representative here for more than 3 years. He calls it Europe's black hole. If Tito could return 30 years after his death, he'd see his brotherhood and unity in ruins, but he'd understand the bureaucratic logjam. In Sarajevo, the eternal flame still burns on the corner of Marshal Tito Street, one of the few that still bears his name. It was lit in remembrance of those Yugoslavs who fought together against the fascists, but also now of those who died more recently in fighting against each other. Of all the republics, Bosnia was the one where Tito's vision seemed most to have taken hold. It had more mixed marriages, more intermingling of identities, and a Jewish community which had flourished since the Middle Ages. As a result of the war, the peoples of Yugoslavia have separated and retreated into their own safe places. There are no roadblocks, no obvious signs of division, except in the minds of Bosnians. Through the Dayton Agreement, the Serbs were in effect bombed into accepting their own peace plan. They still have their own mini-state. They hold 49% of the territory. The Muslims and Croats together have 51%.
So Dayton gave all the power in the state to these two entities, and in particular to the sort of Serb republic, the Republika Srpska, which was led by the Serb nationalists who had engineered the war in the first place. They didn't want Bosnia to exist as a country, they didn't want it to survive, so they saw Dayton really as cementing their little separatist state, which would be a sort of stepping stone towards complete independence and eventually unification with Serbia.
Marco Attila Hoare is a British historian specialising in the former Yugoslavia. He was a translator for an aid group during the Bosnian War and a journalist in Belgrade during the hostilities in Kosovo. He is also, like many who are aware of the region's recent history, a critic of the agreement which burdened Bosnia with an apparently unworkable constitution.
I'm critical of the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia because it's a settlement which was arrived at not with any real principled vision in mind, but on a highly opportunistic basis by the Western governments as a way of ending the war in 1995 without any real consideration of what it would do to the country. They were really concerned, the Americans, to get Bosnia off television screens. This war was incredibly embarrassing to Clinton and damaging to his relations with his British and French allies. So this war was an embarrassment that had to be ended as soon as possible, but really on any price. And what happened then was you had this Dayton settlement imposed, which didn't allow Bosnia to function as a state after the war had ended.
Some of Sarajevo's war damage has been repaired, but a different sort of ruin remains in place. That is the broken political system inherited from Dayton. Bosnia has been brought to the verge of collapse by corruption, the power of veto, and the refusal of its politicians to work together. Politicians from the two main political parties, the Alliance of Independent Social Democrats in Republika Srpska and the Party for Bosnia and Herzegovina in the Muslim Croat Federation, have been ratcheting up the rhetoric of defiance and separatism. People in Bosnia have told me that the situation is the worst since the end of the war. Marco Attila Hoare blames Dayton.
Dayton has left a fractioning, non-functioning society. Central government has no power, which the power is divided between different administrative levels and different entities, and it's left an enormous amount of bitterness among large parts of the population. It hasn't resolved the national question at all. It's almost put it in suspension. And it's created an economy which can't function. Federation in particular is literally crushed by the weight of bureaucracy. There's enormous problems of corruption and organised crime. So it's been a disaster.
By the end of 1996, 16 years after the death of Tito and 1 year into the Dayton Agreement, 17 different foreign governments, 18 UN agencies, 27 intergovernmental agencies and countless NGOs, as well as thousands of troops from across the world, were involved in the reconstruction of Bosnia. But it remains a poor advertisement for foreign aid. The economy has stalled, unemployment is almost 30%, and a quarter of the people live in poverty. According to Transparency International, a respected international organisation, Bosnia is the most corrupt country in the region. Corruption is the backbone of its politics.